Newegg, which is a website that sells multi-year warranties for your AA batteries and also video cards, has just launched a brand new website for selling video cards, and it's called JustGPU. JustGPU features suspicious benchmarks in an attempt to move stale inventory ahead of future launches, with full greater fool theory coming into play here. Except in this scenario, the greatest fool is the one left holding a bag of GPUs ahead of the launch of the next generation of video cards. Now, of course, presented with some neatly packaged marketing, the argument from Newegg might be that this is supposed to be a tool to help people make their purchasing decisions and choose the correct video card for them, offering up selections for purchase on Newegg, of course, once you click through the interface. We're going to dig into this and get into some of the inner workings of JustGPU and talk about why it's pointless and appears very desperate. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and the Silent Base 802 case. The Silent Base 802 got high accolades in our review for its high build quality and its versatility in both silence-focused and airflow-focused builds. The 802 comes with swappable mesh panels or noise-damped panels, so you have options for either approach. The Silent Base 802 case is able to fit larger builds as well without being overbearing, and it stands out for its mechanics quality and assembly quality. Learn more about Be Quiet's new case at the link in the description below. Our biggest problem with JustGPU is that it's misleading at the worst end of things, and it may lead people to purchase video cards that don't really make sense for their system or for what they want to do with it. Because what Newegg is doing is it's trying to take the job of a reviewer and package all of these benchmarks into a website or an effective review and tell you what's best, except for two main problems. One, Newegg sells the video cards, so that's a conflict, but that's okay. And then two, they're doing all of the review process without any of the benchmarking or the review. And so you end up with these bar charts that represent actually nothing, and you have FPS results that come from wherever the GPU supply came from previously. The landing page has buttons for Shop All GPU and Benchmark GPU. Maybe they didn't get the memo that there's more than one now. It also has a button that links to a $5,000 Gleam giveaway. Below these are buttons for top brands, which initially excluded Sapphire and still excludes Power Color, but some reason includes ASRock, which is much newer in the GPU space. On the other hand, ASRock is not new to trying to buy marketing favor and blacklisting reviewers. So let's look back at the website. Clicking on Benchmark GPU brings us to some of the best benchmarks we've ever seen, like this one, showing slot width on a bar chart as bigger bar is better. Triple slots, that means 3, and dual slots, that one means 2, are depicted on the bar graph, and they're shown as, again, bigger is better. Above these, the GPU length, again, bigger bar, better. Newegg also falls into the trap of comparing CUDA cores and clock speeds on a graph, which is pointless. Think about it. If you compare the RTX 3080, which is better, to the RTX 3060, Newegg makes it look like the RTX 3060 is better. The clock speed of higher-end GPUs often drops to accommodate the bigger and more packed-in core, as it does between these two, but the 3080 is still better between the two. And then, of course, you throw an AMD card and a Newegg card. And of course, then you compare an AMD card to an NVIDIA card, and some of the metrics go out the window and disappear from the chart because you can't cross-compare them. And also, intra-comparing them like Newegg is doing here is irresponsible and somewhat reckless because it will lead people to the wrong conclusions without knowing anything about what they're looking at. The worst part of all of this is because Newegg is rebranding this as a different entity, JustGPU, despite their name being in very small print at the bottom. It might make buyers think that this is an independent site, maybe like, well, I'm not going to name them, but like any number of other affiliate link spam websites that actually don't provide any value and just kind of guess at the hierarchy. People might think that these are useful websites trying to rank the products and not just a retailer trying to sell the products to them directly. Of course, when you click on the GPU link, it does eventually take you to Newegg, but it looks exactly the same as an affiliate link spam website. So let's go through some more of the website. Clicking on Shop All GPU, all one of them, takes you to a focused product list that currently features only the NVIDIA RTX 30 series and the AMD RX 6000 series GPUs. Several filters are available on the left-hand side to narrow down the search, and what's more interesting is the benchmarks on each product. JustGPU seems to be pulling data from 3D Mark and using it to show time spy scores. This will come back into play later. Technically, this is a service that UL sells as well. Below the time spy score is an FPS count for Call of Duty, specifically Warzone, running at, quote, 2K resolution. Nobody calls it that. Newegg, JustGPU, don't call it that. It's not the word we use. Clicking that text brings us to some suspiciously clean benchmarks. Choices for resolution include 1080p, 2K, and 4K, and things start to get weird with the CPU selection because the choices are simply 5, 7, or 9 in both the Intel and Ryzen flavors, not specific CPUs, not even generations, just the marketing tiers. Presumably because this will be abandoned by the time the next generation launches, because they just need to sell all these 30 and 6000 series cards now and move along. So making changes to these CPUs sometimes changes the FPS numbers of the various titles below them, but not always. We notice that Newegg's data is bizarrely bound in several places where it really shouldn't be for a GPU benchmark. Additionally, we notice that these numbers always end in 0 or 5. This, to us, is a gigantic red flag of credibility. Rounding to 5 or 0, first of all, serves no purpose here. Secondly, if you're dealing with numbers as low as, say, 30 FPS, which Newegg still considers to be playable, then going from 30 to 35 FPS, because you wanted to round it to make it cleaner, can make a big difference because just 30 to 35 itself is a 17% change. So you chip away some part of that for where they're rounding, and it starts making the gap look much larger than it potentially actually is. It's also just weird because why would you round to 0 or 5 if you have presumably an actual number that came from an actual benchmark anyway? We'll get to the answer in a second. It won't surprise you. I'm doing clickbait, Ron. It will shock you. So if you're at 34.3, sure, round it to 34. But why round it to 35 or to 30? It just doesn't really add any value here. And so the problem for us is more of the red flag indicator of where do these numbers actually exist? Or were they random number generated? We also noticed something peculiar. If you take a cross-section of some of the results on Newegg's website, JustGPU's website, we spotted that the percentage scaling, or the percent improvement from a lower-end card to a higher-end one, often identically lands at a clean 20.00%, 25.00%, 50.00%, and so on. These numbers are suspicious again to us, and it sounds like they're approximating a result based on non-sequitur benchmarks or number sources. In fact, if you scroll down just below these comparison bars, Newegg, JustGPU has a disclaimer on its website that states this, quote, disclaimer, benchmarks, including frames per second, FPS, and time spy score, are estimations based on system configurations. Data is provided by 3D Mark directly and not Newegg. Actual performance may vary. They even say they're estimations. We don't have to jump to the conclusion that we assume to us this means fake, as in completely fabricated, but Newegg doesn't make it clear which data is provided by 3D Mark. So even if we're being generous and we say the time spy score is provided by 3D Mark, where do all these game benchmarks come from? Because 3D Mark, as great of a tool as it is, especially for overclocking and competition, it doesn't give you a great overall picture of how a product performs versus its competitors because they change game to game and based on the scenario. And by the way, time spy alone is not sufficient to make these comparisons. So, and it's not even clear that that data comes from 3D Mark. Newegg could be pulling that from its database based on random people with random configurations that are running these GPUs. The 3D Mark's company does sell benchmarking services. Their parent company is UL, Underwriters Laboratories. And that's fine. It doesn't sound like something that Newegg has used, but it's not very clear. And it's unethical for a media outlet to do that. But for UL, it doesn't really matter because they're just a lab. They don't present to the consumer. They present for companies. They do testing for companies and they sell the data to those companies to use in marketing or in certification processes to meet ISO standards or whatever it may be. Let's look at some of the data and see if it's any good. So first, clicking through the website, we notice that they're bound heavily or really fudging the numbers with some CPUs. Some of these games don't move between CPU choices, even at the lower resolutions where a CPU bind is likely. We saw instances where results were the same across the board. To make this easier to compare, we made our own chart. With Newegg's own data, we just pooled it all in one place to get a quicker evaluation instead of clicking through a clumsy interface. For example, the RX 6600 XT, the RX 6800, the RX 6700 XT, and the RX 6800 XT all showed 275 FPS average for CSGO at 1080p with an Intel i7. Yet, suspiciously, they're all locked to 260 FPS average at 1440p. So we somehow switched from an alleged yet very unlikely CPU bind on a 6600 XT at 1080p to a GPU bind at 1440p. This is technically possible with things like driver overhead and really specific scenarios, but given the context, it seems more likely that it's just bad testing or faked results or improperly approximated fake results. Moving to NVIDIA, we noticed much the same. Rainbow Six is entirely CPU bound, even at the RTX 3060 Ti level. And so is CSGO, by the way, and Far Cry 6, which is miraculously also CPU bound at 1080p. Cyberpunk isn't far from a CPU bind down the stack as well. These benchmarks are worthless. If we produced this many numbers the same on this many GPUs with this many games, we would throw out all of the data. It's a GPU benchmark. You have to know which GPU you want to buy by knowing the differences. When all the numbers are identical, there's a problem. Sometimes it's the testing process. Sometimes you're trying to demonstrate a GPU bind or a CPU bind somewhere else by looking at what other parts limit the component you're testing. In this instance, sure, maybe they're just trying to give a demonstration of bad data and improper benchmarking techniques by ruining about half of the data. We would normally limit that to one chart to make a point, but you could also do it to all of them, either way. So we would rerun these and throw out the original data. They're just showing them all to be the same product here. 1080p with higher settings is still plenty to produce differences, and we can look at some comparisons. We're going to show a few charts to demonstrate the percent increase in performance from one GPU to another. So that would be the improvement, the percent increase in GPUs from A versus B, and we're taking those two percentages from Newegg's comparison, A to B GPUs, GN's comparison, A to B GPUs, where we've hand tested them so we know where the data came from, what benches they came off of. And additionally, some data is missing between the two of us, because we're different groups and we don't test the same games or the same way, so there will be a few blank spots. But even though testing methodology and graphic settings may differ between two outlets, what really matters is the relative percent scaling. That should be about the same, especially between two GPUs, and should be predictable with different sets of results if you have sufficient data to start drawing those conclusions, and we do. The RX 6400 versus RX 6600 is up first, shown at 1080p. Here, Newegg saw an 82% improvement with the 6600, whereas we saw a 117% improvement in our testing. That's a pretty large difference. Newegg saw a 78% improvement in Far Cry 6 to the 6600 from the 6400, but we saw a 115% improvement in GTA 5. We saw almost a doubling of performance, but Newegg was down at 67%. In the very least, between the first two games and GTA, we both saw percent increase reduction, so that lines up. But what's truly unlikely or bizarre is Newegg's Rainbow Six result, which loses step with the scaling and lands at 47% uplift for a 6600 over a 6400. So to be clear, if you're a random consumer, you've never really seen benchmarks before, you look at this website, the takeaway you get is that the 6600, which is a $280 card right now, versus the RX 6400, which is a $160 card, is anywhere from 47% to 82% better. And we're saying that it's anywhere from about 100% to 117% better. Obviously, it can be a little bit outside those ranges, but based on the numbers we're looking at today. Big difference in the conclusions that we're both drawing here. And we're not a retailer. And also, we don't have a big disclaimer that says benchmarks are pulled out of thin air and approximated. That's probably the part that matters more. Checking data from other reviewers, we noticed similar differences against Newegg's results, so it's not just us. The next one looks at the 3060 Ti versus the RTX 3080 at 1080p. Here, Newegg has the 3080 only 50% better than the RTX 3060 Ti in Tomb Raider, where we saw an 81% improvement. And Newegg's uplift was a clean 50.00%. That's suspicious. Likewise, in Rainbow Six, we saw a 39% improvement, where Newegg saw a 2.8% uplift. In Far Cry 6, we saw an 18% improvement to Newegg's 9%, so a doubling of the relative improvement. The only believable result here is from Cyberpunk, although for us, that's data that's a year old now because we haven't continued benchmarking that game. Newegg's numbers here, they're so chaotic and random that it really looks like they did some kind of weird RNG spreadsheet, like an equals rand between 0 and 100%, and then multiplied it against some base result like TimeSpy or whatever. We're really not sure how they're approximating these, where they're getting it. But approximating benchmarks in general is not a great practice, and doing it when you have no basis in reality is a very bad practice, which is what's happening here. So these are completely useless. The point is apparently to help consumers to pick between products. The real point is to sell products because they're stuck with them, and especially stuck with them looking at the RTX 40 series and the AMD RX 7000 series coming out. It's not bad. We don't begrudge a retailer for trying to retail things. That's what they do. It's okay to want to sell products, but they should do it in a responsible way and not dance around like they're reviewers when actually what they're doing is probably faking the results, or either they're not close enough to reality to. It's just misleading, is where we are with this. Now let's look at another one just for fun. The RTX 3090 Ti versus the RX 6800 XT at 4K this time. Newegg reported a clean 25% improvement to the 3090 Ti in Tomb Raider, in Cyberpunk, which we don't have data for, and in Rainbow Six Siege. Amazing how it just happens to be 25% exactly between these games. And we've seen this with multiple of their GPUs against each other when taking all their numbers and dumping it into one spreadsheet. Now, we saw 22% in Tomb Raider, so that's closer to Newegg, but we saw 44% in GTA and Rainbow Six, far different than Newegg's result. Now, finally, at the end of all this, we got curious about, well, where is Newegg pulling these numbers? And so we took their TimeSpy number that they had for each GPU and started just calculating percentages against the TimeSpy numbers between themselves. We ran some math against these. Lo and behold, in the most recent example here, the RTX 3090 Ti just happened to have a TimeSpy score that was approximately 25% higher than the 6800 XT's TimeSpy score. That doesn't mean that's how the games scale. TimeSpy is a synthetic benchmark. It's a great tool. It's not for making gaming comparisons. And that it looks like that 25% magical number here came from TimeSpy, and they might be doing that for the other ones as well. That might be the source of the approximation. But the one thing we know for fact, no need for speculation, is that Newegg is approximating because it's told us as much. So our belief here, the whole point of this video is just to say, look, this site, JustGPU, it's owned by Newegg. They don't hide it. It's not particularly obvious, but until you click the links and see they're all Newegg, and then you scroll down to the bottom and see Newegg.com, it is entirely branded as something else, and it starts to look like one of the GPU or CPU or SSD comparison sites that are out there that we're not going to name because a lot of them also act in what we think is bad faith. And this is an irresponsible representation of the products that they're selling. It's irresponsible to show things like bar charts where you have slot count and size designated as bars on a graph where it's assumed that larger is better. And it's also irresponsible to basically, in our eyes, fabricate your testing data and present numbers which don't seem to align with reality. So that's it for our review of Newegg's new JustGPU website. If you want to buy GPUs from Newegg, whatever, but don't use their benchmarks to make your decision. They're not going to help you. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, like by grabbing one of these t-shirts, which we are almost out of stock of, by the way, on the store, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.